and the guns may have gone quieter for the moment, but the real contest around Iran did not end with a temporary ceasefire. It moved inward into the machinery of power, where clerics, civilian officials, the Revolutionary Guard, the security apparatus, and the judiciary are all trying to shape the same question: what comes next? That is the struggle, now less visible than missile strikes, but far more important to Iran's long-term direction publicly. Tehran is balancing threat and negotiation at the same time. Washington is doing the same. The result is a political environment filled with mixed signals, where one institution speaks the language of deterrence while another leaves room for bargaining, and every message is also aimed at domestic audiences. Observers say this is not unusual for Iran's system, but wartime pressure makes the fractures sharper. In peacetime, multiple power centers can coexist and coordinate. In crisis, those same structures begin competing for influence over military decisions, diplomatic posture, and the national narrative itself. That is why the question is not only what Iran will do on the battlefield. The deeper question is which faction inside the system will define the final strategy. Some favor confrontation and assume escalation is unavoidable, while others focus on the cost of war, economic stability, and the danger of strategic overreach. On April 21st, Iran's military said it would immediately strike pre-selected targets if the United States launched any new attack. A spokesman for Iran's Qatar al-Anbiya central headquarters said Iranian forces had long been at full readiness and would respond quickly and forcefully to any aggression. The statement came after repeated warnings from President Donald Trump and senior American military officials. The Iranian warning followed Trump's announcement that the United States would extend the ceasefire with Iran for another 2 weeks at Pakistan's request. At the same time, he said the American naval blockade of Iranian ports would remain in place. That combination, a ceasefire on paper and pressure at sea in practice, is exactly the kind of dual message that makes the current environment so unstable. Iranian outlets argued that the extension could mean Washington failed to achieve its objectives during the conflict. They suggested Trump had tested available options and concluded that continued fighting would not deliver meaningful gains. At the same time, those same reports warned that a ceasefire extension could also serve as cover for a surprise strike or for a shift in which Israel continued the fight while the United States tried to step back publicly. Tehran's position is that the blockade itself is a hostile act. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi called the blockade of Iranian ports an act of war and a violation of the ceasefire arrangement. A senior advisor to the Speaker of Iran's parliament said the losing side cannot dictate terms and argued that continued encirclement is no different from bombing and should be met with a military response. Iranian state media also signaled that Tehran did not intend to recognize a unilateral American extension of the ceasefire. Pakistan is reportedly planning a second round of talks between the United States and Iran, and Washington has expressed interest in participating. Tehran, however, has delayed, objecting to the ongoing naval pressure. At the same time, an older controversy returned to the surface. Social media users and political figures in the United States revived the claim that former President Barack Obama gave Iran $1.7 billion in cash and had it flown overnight by aircraft. Trump repeated that line in a speech about the conflict with Iran. The core of the claim is real, but the framing leaves out the legal context. The payment was tied to Iranian assets that had been frozen since the 1970s, after Iran had paid $400 million for military equipment that was never delivered following the collapse of relations after the 1979 revolution. In 2016, the Obama administration settled the dispute by agreeing to return the principal plus about $1.3 billion in accumulated interest. The administration at the time confirmed that the payment was made in cash and in foreign currencies such as euros and Swiss francs. The reason was simple. Sanctions had cut Iran out of normal dollar-based banking channels, making a standard transfer impossible. Arms control researchers later said the money was not a gift from Washington to Tehran, but the return of Iranian funds under a legal settlement. The regional picture around Iran remains equally fragile. Israel ordered people in Lebanon to stay away from border areas and parts of the south, despite an active ceasefire. The Israeli military warned civilians not to approach a strip along the frontier and not to enter the Litani River zone, while maps showed dozens of villages either restricted or still unsafe for return. Israel said it was maintaining a presence in southern Lebanon to address what it considered threats from Hezbollah. Earlier, it announced a new deployment line stretching from east to west and extending several kilometers into Lebanese territory. Reports from the area suggested Israeli forces were destroying villages to establish a buffer zone for northern Israel. The ceasefire, brokered by the United States and lasting 10 days, reduced direct fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, but only in the narrowest sense. Hezbollah maintained that it still had the right to resist Israeli military presence. Lebanese warnings echoed that concern, urging residents not to return too quickly because the area remained dangerous. Hezbollah also claimed that explosive devices planted by the group destroyed 4 Israeli tanks, though Israel did not publicly confirm that report. The Israeli military did report that 1 soldier was killed and 9 others were wounded in clashes on April 20th. So even where ceasefires exist, they are operating more like pauses than settlements. The pressure on the wider Gulf energy system has been severe. Kuwait Petroleum Corporation issued a force majeure notice to customers after repeated damage to energy infrastructure and disruptions linked to the conflict. The company had already taken similar steps earlier in the year regarding crude oil and refined product sales. Officials said Kuwait's energy output had fallen to levels comparable to the early 1990s, after the Iraq War. Even if the conflict cools, restoring full operations is expected to take time. The near paralysis of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has jammed storage systems, disrupted export routes, and unsettled global oil markets. For the Gulf monarchies, this is close to a worst-case scenario. Their budgets remain heavily dependent on energy exports, and any sustained choke point at Hormuz quickly turns into a fiscal problem. American estimates suggested that more than 9 million barrels of oil per day could be disrupted in April alone. That same logic is feeding back into domestic American politics. The Trump administration has begun setting up a mechanism known as CAPE to refund businesses harmed by earlier tariff policies. The system is intended to simplify what had become a complicated process by allowing grouped electronic reimbursements rather than dealing with each shipment separately. The move came after the United States Supreme Court struck down several Trump tariffs, ruling that he had exceeded his authority under Emergency Economic Powers Law. By March, the American government estimated it had collected $166 billion in tariffs. Officials had tried to delay refunds, but a trade court later ordered Washington to begin repayment. Elsewhere in Asia, Singapore is quietly building the technical and regulatory base for possible future use of nuclear power. Its National Environment Agency and the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission signed a cooperation agreement on the sidelines of an international atomic energy meeting in Vienna. Singaporean officials will train and intern with the American regulator in reactor operations, risk assessment, and inspection procedures. Singapore is also expanding cooperation with France and Finland and continuing studies on nuclear safety and environmental impact. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has said the government will approach nuclear power cautiously but systematically. For a city-state with limited renewable options and ambitious emissions goals, this is less ideology than energy arithmetic. One incident in the Strait of Hormuz highlighted another Iranian problem: target control under pressure. On April 18th, Iranian forces reportedly struck 2 Indian-flagged ships, an event that raised concern not only in New Delhi, but across the shipping world. Analysts widely suggested the vessels were hit by mistake rather than as part of a deliberate attack on India. That distinction matters, but it does not make the episode less serious. One of the ships was reportedly carrying about 2 million barrels of Iraqi crude, and although there were no crew fatalities, one vessel sustained light damage. India summoned the Iranian ambassador and expressed deep concern, while also asking Tehran to restore safe passage for ships traveling toward India. The incident exposed the strain inside Iran's wartime operating environment. India is not an enemy of Iran and has maintained a working relationship with Tehran, including renewed oil imports under temporary sanctions relief. If Iranian forces are struggling to distinguish friend from foe in a crowded maritime battlespace, that is not just a tactical error, it is a signal of system overload. Iran's ambassador to Russia, Qasem Jalali, meanwhile said Tehran is planning the future of its nuclear program within the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. He repeated Iran's position that it has the right to peaceful nuclear energy. That line is designed to sound legal, measured, and internationally familiar, even as the surrounding strategic environment becomes more combustible. The history behind that program is long. Iran began developing nuclear activity in the 1950s under the Shah with American support, joined the International Atomic Energy Agency in the late 1950s, signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the late 1960s, and ratified it in the early 1970s. After the 1979 revolution, the program was suspended and later revived in the late 1980s, while Iranian leaders insisted that religious rulings prohibited nuclear weapons. Trump has also rejected claims that Israel persuaded him to go to war with Iran. He said the trigger was the result of the October 7th attack on Israel and his long-standing view that Iran must never possess a nuclear weapon. American officials have repeatedly denied accusations from some of Trump's own supporters that Israel dragged Washington into the conflict. At home, the White House is trying to contain one of the clearest economic consequences of the war: fuel prices. Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to sign a set of presidential memoranda related to coal supply chains, domestic oil production, natural gas transport, liquefied natural gas capacity, power grid investment, and other key energy infrastructure. The aim is straightforward: push more supply into the system and soften the political cost of expensive energy. American officials have offered different forecasts, but the shared message is the same. They expect gasoline prices to ease when the conflict cools, though not immediately. By April 19th, the national average had climbed to just over $4 per gallon, well above the roughly $3.16 seen a year earlier. Increasing pressure on Republicans ahead of the midterm elections. Rising fuel costs have also affected airlines, housing, fertilizer, and food. Transportation officials said there had been only modest disruption to jet fuel supply and expressed hope that costs would fall once the Iran-related tensions eased. But hope is not a policy, and voters tend to judge reality at the pump, not in briefings. The administration also faced another domestic distraction when Labor Secretary Lori Chavez de Rimmer stepped down amid a series of controversies. Her lawyer said the resignation was a personal decision rather than the result of legal wrongdoing. The White House said she would move to the private sector, while the Deputy Secretary would serve as acting Labor Secretary. Her tenure had been clouded by multiple allegations, including questions about inappropriate relationships and travel-related misconduct involving senior aides. 2 top assistants had already resigned following an inquiry into suspected misuse of official events to justify personal travel. The legal outcome remains one question. The political damage is another. In Europe, the International Criminal Court issue has reappeared in Hungarian politics. Hungary's Prime Minister-elect, Peter Magyar, indicated that if Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu entered Hungarian territory while an active ICC warrant remained in force, he would have to be arrested. He also said he had informed Netanyahu of his desire to reintegrate Hungary into the ICC system. That would mark a clear change from the course pursued by Viktor Orban. who had moved Hungary away from the court while maintaining close ties with Netanyahu. The Israeli leader and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant are both subject to ICC arrest warrants over alleged war crimes connected to the Gaza war, which they deny. Here again, law, alliance politics, and domestic transition are colliding in public view. China's trade with Iran and the Gulf states has also taken a direct hit from the disruption around Hormuz. Chinese customs data showed steep declines in trade flows, with imports from Iran falling sharply and exports of refined products plunging even more dramatically. Across the wider Gulf region, Chinese exports and imports both dropped as the maritime choke point tightened. The underlying issue is not hard to see. Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a geopolitical lever, and when it is constricted, the effects spread far beyond the Gulf. Analysts say that even if a ceasefire holds, insurance costs for energy and shipping are unlikely to fall quickly because the security risk will remain built into the market. China has tried to offset the losses by increasing imports from Russia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. That has softened the blow in aggregate oil volumes, but not every commodity is easily replaceable. Sulfur supply, much of it tied to the Middle East, dropped sharply during the conflict, exposing another supply chain bottleneck with few easy substitutes. The uncertainty is now visible in American polling as well. A recent survey showed Trump's approval falling to about 37% as voters worried about the economy and his handling of the Iran crisis. High energy prices can become a strategic tax on the public, and prolonged uncertainty only deepens that effect. Indonesia, by contrast, has announced a major gas discovery that could strengthen its long-term energy position. Officials said a field in East Kalimantan holds roughly 5 trillion cubic feet of gas and about 300 million barrels of associated liquid hydrocarbons. The discovery was made at the Jing North area, with drilling at significant depth in deep water. The Indonesian government says the find supports national energy security and aligns with President Prabowo's call to keep searching for new oil and gas sources. Output from the operator could rise sharply by the late 2020s if development proceeds as planned. It is another reminder that in energy politics, today's choke point and tomorrow's supply base often exist in the same strategic story. In the Caribbean, Cuba and the United States have quietly resumed direct contact in Havana. Cuban officials said recent talks took place at vice minister level and were handled discreetly, without deadlines or threats. Despite more dramatic media speculation, for Havana, easing the energy embargo is the central priority. The broader backdrop remains decades of American sanctions plus additional pressure imposed this year, including tighter restrictions on oil. No breakthrough is visible yet. Still, the fact that both sides have reopened direct channels suggests that even under pressure, both see some value in controlled dialogue. Qatar is another state feeling the aftershocks of the Iran conflict in unusually direct form. According to reporting cited in the transcript, the country endured roughly 700 missile and drone attacks from Iran, most aimed at American military bases on Qatari territory. Air defenses intercepted most of them, and there were no reported civilian deaths, but the economic effects were severe. Tourism almost stopped. National carrier operations were interrupted. Foreign residents began leaving in larger numbers, while business and service activity slowed sharply across parts of the country. For an economy tied heavily to energy and services, that kind of shock spreads quickly. The deepest damage was in liquefied natural gas, the core of Qatar's economic model. Qatar Energy was forced to halt production at Ras Laffan after transport routes through Hormuz became unsafe, and one direct strike reportedly damaged the facility earlier in the conflict. The energy minister said full recovery could take up to 5 years, with annual revenue losses of around $20 billion, a huge share of the state's expected budget. The strategic shock was not only economic, Doha had invested heavily in its relationship with Trump through gestures, investments, and promises of larger financial engagements. Yet regional observers concluded that when the real test came, Israel still held far greater influence in Washington than any Gulf monarchy. That realization matters because influence is not measured in speeches, it is measured in outcomes. Qatar still has the financial capacity to absorb immediate losses, but the more difficult question is whether it can preserve its reputation as a safe and stable destination for international investors. Even so, Qatar has started to reopen part of its international aviation network. The Civil Aviation Authority said foreign carriers would gradually resume flights to and from Doha after a full review of readiness and coordination with relevant agencies. Operations will follow strict international safety and security standards. Earlier in the crisis, only limited flights had resumed, mostly for evacuation, repatriation, and cargo. Qatar Airways maintained a reduced network linking Doha with major European cities through special air corridors. The current restoration marks a step toward normalization, though not yet a return to full confidence. Iran has also tried to draw lines between adversaries and states it still wants to accommodate. On April 20th, Tehran said it would guarantee unimpeded passage for Russian ships and cargo through Hormuz. Even as the waterway remained at the center of confrontation with Washington, Foreign Minister Arakachi reportedly explained Iran's position to his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, while accusing the United States of violating the ceasefire through its naval blockade and the seizure of an Iranian container vessel in the Gulf of Oman. By giving Moscow special assurances, Tehran is signaling selective access rather than general openness. Russia, for its part, has repeated its willingness to help broker arrangements between Iran and Arab Gulf states. That fits Moscow's longer-term proposal for a collective security framework in the Gulf, built around dialogue among all littoral states and selected outside powers. Meanwhile, the cost of America's military campaign against Iran is climbing rapidly. A monitoring group cited in the transcript said the Pentagon's direct expenses had exceeded $55 billion in the first 50 days of the conflict. The main drivers were the use of expensive precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, advanced interceptors, and the logistical burden of sustaining a large deployed force. The deeper problem is structural. Modern war is not just bombs and missiles. It is surveillance, reconnaissance, satellites, command networks, cyber support, logistics, and replenishment running all the time across multiple domains. Precision can reduce some forms of direct casualty, but it often raises the financial cost dramatically. That creates an asymmetric trap. Iran can use relatively cheap drones and missiles, while the United States often responds with far more expensive defensive systems. Over time, this ratio matters. It is not only about who can strike harder, it is about who can absorb the exchange rate of war longer. This is one reason Iran has reportedly studied the Russia-Ukraine war so closely. Internal Iranian research, as cited in the transcript, focused on the central role of unmanned systems in modern conflict, especially smaller drones that can be produced cheaply, deployed in large numbers, and adapted quickly. Tehran has also been examining additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and other technologies that compress development time and cost. These lessons are no longer theoretical. Iranian-aligned groups have already used first-person view drones of the type made famous in Ukraine against American targets in Iraq. Some reportedly used fiber optic guidance rather than radio signals, reducing their vulnerability to electronic jamming. Iran has also learned from Russia more directly. Moscow's battlefield experience has led to improvements in drone range, guidance systems, and domestic production, and military cooperation gives Tehran access to data and operational patterns. The logic extends to the maritime domain as well. where even relatively simple Iranian unmanned naval systems could pose serious risks in the confined waters of Hormuz. Another lesson from the Ukraine war is endurance. Russian experience suggests that a heavily sanctioned state can continue fighting and functioning if it adapts internally and builds alternative channels of trade and finance. Iran, with decades of sanctions experience and informal networks already in place, appears to believe it can survive pressure without fundamentally changing policy. That belief feeds military reform. Iranian assessments reportedly call for a more flexible arms structure, better strategic planning, stronger recruitment of technical specialists, and more investment in drones, lasers, and space-related platforms for the United States. That means the challenge is not static, it is learning, adjusting, and getting cheaper. Beyond the Middle East, regional instability is radiating outward in other ways. Thailand's military evacuated hundreds of civilians from a border area in Mae Hong Son province after a Myanmar airstrike sent at least one bomb into Thai territory. No casualties were reported on the Thai side, but the incident triggered panic and forced authorities to establish a safety corridor and raise alert levels along the frontier. Japan has also taken several significant steps with wider strategic implications. On April 21st, its Cabinet and National Security Council approved a relaxation of restrictions on lethal weapons exports, marking a major shift in the country's post-war security policy. The changes are framed as a response to the most serious security environment Tokyo believes it has faced since the end of the Second World War. The revised policy removes earlier limits that had confined exports mainly to non-combat categories such as rescue, transport, warning, surveillance, and minesweeping. In principle, Japan still bans arms exports to countries involved in active conflict, but the new rules allow exceptions in special circumstances tied to Japan's own security needs and American operations. In the Indo-Pacific, defense equipment will now be divided more clearly into weapons and non-weapons based on lethal capability. Non-weapon systems such as warning and control radars can be exported with fewer restrictions, while weapons, and including destroyers and missiles, can go only to countries that have signed agreements with Japan on handling classified defense information. A next-generation fighter being developed with Britain and Italy will be treated as a special case requiring cabinet approval. Japan was also shaken by a deadly training accident. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi confirmed that an explosion during a military exercise at a ground self-defense force range in Oita killed 3 soldiers and injured another. Early reports said a round exploded inside a Type 10 tank during live-fire target practice. The Type 10 is Japan's most advanced main battle tank, developed from the 1990s and introduced into service in the early 2010s. It carries a 120mm smoothbore gun with an automatic loading system and typically operates with a 3-person crew, and authorities are still investigating what caused the blast. On the same day, Japan also faced a natural hazard. After a strong offshore earthquake near Aomori, Prime Minister Takaichi urged people in affected areas to evacuate immediately because of tsunami warnings. The quake was estimated magnitude 7.5, and warnings were issued for several Pacific coastal zones. Tsunami waves were later recorded in multiple locations, with the highest reaching about 80 centimeters at one port. Thousands of households were placed under evacuation orders. Rail services were suspended in several areas, and nuclear power plants in Miyagi, Fukushima, Aomori, and Ibaraki carried out safety inspections. No abnormalities were immediately reported, but the episode was another reminder that Japan manages geostrategic tension and natural risk at the same time. In Europe's east, Hungary's incoming leadership is also signaling changes. Peter Magyar said that if the Druzhba pipeline is technically ready to operate, Ukraine should reopen it as previously promised, and Russia should continue pumping oil to keep the route functioning He rejected the idea of using oil flows as a bargaining chip in exchange for financial or political concessions linked to Ukraine's European Union ambitions. Magyar also pledged reforms aimed at unlocking European Union funds frozen for Hungary, focusing on anti-corruption measures and press freedom. At the same time, he asked Brussels to consider pausing penalties linked to Hungary's refusal to comply with migrant quota rules. The message is clear. Budapest, under new leadership, may seek a more workable relationship with the European Union, but it will still bargain hard. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, meanwhile, used an interview to emphasize the legal and military bond between Minsk and Moscow. He said Russia had made clear it would use all available military means to defend Belarus if necessary. He also described the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus as a security guarantee rather than a threat. Lukashenko claimed the United States had no intention of going to war with Belarus and said he would be open to a major agreement with Washington if it reflected mutual interests. He even suggested that the United States could use Belarus as a channel to Moscow. Whether that is an invitation, a signal, or simply positioning, it reflects Minsk's effort to market itself as both protected and useful. The United Nations has warned that the war in Ukraine is escalating in the absence of real diplomatic progress. At a Security Council meeting, senior officials said fighting had intensified, civilian casualties were rising, and destruction was spreading. Since May 2022, at least 15,578 Ukrainian civilians have reportedly been killed and more than 43,000 injured. Officials also warned of the danger posed by military activity near nuclear facilities, especially the Zaporizhzhia plant, with the anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster approaching. They stressed that any fighting near nuclear infrastructure must stop immediately. Humanitarian officials added that attacks on transport routes were making aid delivery harder and that a large funding gap remained for relief operations. The Kremlin, for its part, signaled that the European Union would likely continue financing Ukraine despite past Hungarian resistance, especially after Magyar's election victory. Since Russia's full-scale war began, Ukraine has received enormous military and financial support from the European Union. The underlying debate inside Europe now is less about whether support continues than about how bloc decision-making should work when one capital tries to block the rest. Taken together, these developments form a larger pattern. Iran's immediate confrontation with the United States and Israel is only one layer of the story. Beneath it lies a competition over internal power, maritime choke points, weapons, economics, sanctions, endurance, alliance credibility, and the rising strategic cost of keeping old security architectures alive. That is why the temporary ceasefire by itself does not settle much. Iran still sees the naval blockade as a continuation of war by other means. The United States still wants pressure without uncontrolled escalation. Regional states are trying to protect trade, energy flows, and domestic stability while discovering that even limited conflict now reaches ports and prices, insurance markets, air routes, and political legitimacy. So the central issue is no longer just whether the shooting stops for 2 weeks. It is whether any side can build a stable framework after the pause ends. And right now, the evidence points in the opposite direction. More friction, more adaptation, more selective bargaining, and a wider battlefield where economics and logistics are often as decisive as missiles. In that sense, the hidden struggle inside Iran matters as much as the visible one outside it. Whoever shapes Tehran's final strategy will not just determine Iran's next move against Washington or Israel. They will help decide whether the region drifts toward managed confrontation, sudden escalation, or a harder and colder reality in which everyone claims to want restraint while preparing for the next round.